Remember that Locke convinces us that there's stuff out there, and those things that are out there, the objects themselves, the thing in itself, apart from the way it appears to us, for Locke, actually exists out there. And things exist out there because they're made up of atoms that are hard little things that don't go away, right? The problem for Locke is that you can't actually ever see those things. That's kind of an assumption that there's stuff out there that's causing these impressions. Berkeley was afraid that the materialism of that philosophy that John Locke had was going to lead people away from belief in God. Because if you believe that the universe is completely made up of these atoms that are what account for the stability of the universe, that you're not going to feel that they're constantly dependent on God for every moment, right? You know, the theory that everything existed was based on God's mind and of controlling everything from moment to moment. So if God decided, well, okay, and changed his mind about something, then the earth would change based on that, right? Well, the thing is, if everything is made up of atoms that God created and he just put this clock, this perfect clock, into, started it up and let it go off, you would never need God again. Because the clock is fine all by itself without God. Well, if that's the case, then you would begin to doubt that God is constantly important for each step of your life, right? Instead, you could just consider yourself a believer because God created everything, but now you just need to be a scientist to know how everything works, right? So there's no need to pray. It doesn't do any good. If you're praying to God, please, save the life of, whatever, right? Bring my people home, whatever you're praying for, well, that's not going to do any good because it's a matter of science. How do you actually figure out how to cure somebody? How do you actually negotiate with someone by exchanging things in order to make sure that you get what you want and they get what they want, right? I mean, that's independent of any divine authority, right? So Berkeley is afraid that this materialist philosophy of John Locke is going to lead people away from religion. You're going to end up with people becoming atheists. And in fact, that is exactly what's happened. When people accept John Locke's philosophy as kind of common sense, right? You end up with American deism, for example. And Thomas Jefferson, again, was an example of that. And if you read Jefferson's Bible, Jefferson went through his Bible and he had multiple translations of it, French, Latin, I'm not sure what other languages, but he had a whole bunch of them, and he went through them and he took out what he believed to be true and he threw away all the stuff that he didn't accept. So the life and morals of Jesus, as far as Thomas Jefferson was concerned, he was a man and a teacher, but not divine. Jefferson didn't believe that was possible. By the way, this Bible, which you could buy copies of it, and Senator Church is the one who wrote the foreword to it, which is kind of interesting too, by the way. lots of different people in government, when they swear on the Bible, this is the Bible that they swear on. That's true. It's kind of, lots of different folks pointed out that they use the Jefferson Bible. But the Jefferson Bible isn't the Christian Bible. It's the Bible according to Thomas Jefferson, who went through it as an American deist, who didn't believe that you needed divine, and didn't believe that Jesus was divine, except that he was a really, really good guy. So Greek, Latin, French, and English were the languages that he used. So, by the way, it is on the web, so if you want to just read, there's explanations of why he created his own Bible, and it looks like this might be the entire thing. So you could see what he's done with that. But American deism. So you've got theism. Theism is when you believe in a God and you believe that you can have a relationship with that God. That's a theist. Right? A deist, on the other hand, believes that God created everything, but then it's like a perfect clock all running on its own, and you don't really have any interaction with God anymore. So that's, I suppose, pretty interesting. So what Berkeley was afraid of happened. And in fact, when we look at Europe today, Northern Europe especially, notice that there are very few Christians anymore. They still have and support all the different cathedrals and churches and things, primarily as tourist opportunity, right? They're rebuilding the church in Paris that was destroyed by fire recently, Notre Dame, right? And they're rebuilding it. Lots of donors have put in the money for it. It's not actually being funded by the state. It's being funded by donors. They're rebuilding it as a tourist opportunity, not as a place of worship anymore. So that's kind of interesting. In fact, the French have a philosophy which is referred to as laïcité. Where you're supposed to be secular. If you're in France and you're out in public, you're supposed to be secular, as opposed to demonstrating a religious affiliation. They have problems with that because Islamists prefer to wear particular garb to indicate that they're Muslim, as opposed to Northern European. And I think the French keep coming up with new laws to try to prevent them from doing that. You can't wear your the head cover, while you're in a public place or going to school and so on. And of course, if you're a girl over in the age of, I think, 13, you're supposed to wear a head cover. Does that make sense? Notice in the United States, you're perfectly allowed to wear whatever you want as long as you wear something, right? That's pretty much the way things are in the United States. Because in a sense, we have a much more open understanding of the relationship between church and state. In fact, the arguments we get into over Thomas Jefferson and his statute. I think I started talking about it. I'm not sure if I finished, but his concern was that you didn't have to be a member of the Anglican Church in order to be a member of the governmental, any of the offices in government, elected office, and so on. So he's the one that gave us in Virginia a separation of church and state clause, which then was added to the Constitution Um, so that as a country, we're following Jefferson's thinking in that regard, right? But what everyone, I think, understands is that the goal of this was not to have the state impose restrictions on religion, but instead to keep religion from imposing restrictions on the state. Right? But if you go to France, they're actually much more progressive, if you want to call it that, right? I mean, that's your point of view, in that the state imposes restrictions on religion. So that's the laïcité, which just means secular. They're imposing a secular point of view on people in France. You could be religious, but only in private. Yes?
Isn't the idea that in America we have freedom to religion, but in France it's freedom from religion? And that's like the freedom of religion.
I guess that's a good way of putting it.
I've heard that somewhere.
Yeah, the concern though is that you don't want religion imposing restrictions on who can be elected. That was Jefferson's concern, because he was an American deist, not a member of the Anglican Church, and he wanted to be in government. So he had, you see the difference. You don't want religions, and the rationale at the time was the colonies were all religious, but different religions, right? So you had the Quakers were the Pennsylvania. Right. Initially, it was William Penn, hence Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods, right, Pennsylvania. Although Penn didn't stay there, he went back to England and left his followers running things until those in the West basically decided we're going to overrun the state, and they had guns, which the Quakers didn't. So they basically took over that. So it didn't stay Quaker for very long. Although there are lots of Quaker. Meeting, there's still plenty of Quakers there, but it's no longer a Quaker-based state. But then you had the Puritans that landed in New England, right? I know one young lady that was interviewed by Jay Leno. Remember, Jay Leno used to do his jaywalking, he called it, where he'd go out and interview people and ask them really simple questions. And he was in California, and he asked this one person about where the Pilgrims had landed. And she said, where did she say? Where did the Pilgrims land?
Let's go with Florida.
Plymouth. Which is funny, because they left from Plymouth, and where they landed was Plymouth. I mean, they not really very creative, I guess, but so yes, Plymouth. The trouble is there's a Plymouth in Oregon, apparently, and so this lady thought, oh, Oregon. Where did they land? They sailed across the Atlantic and landed in Oregon. That's not really. Florida's a much better deal. But they would have had to have gone down somehow. I don't know how the sailing ships did. I don't know how they survived in those things. Have you ever seen? You could go see them. In like Baltimore, there's one. In Boston Harbor, there's one. You can see these old ships, and you think, how are they floating? Still today. But they actually sailed across the ocean in those things. Bathtubs with a mast, basically. But in any case, so all of the 13 colonies had a state religion at the time of the War of Independence. And so the problem they had was, how do we separate all these different, because what clearly was going to happen is each of the different state religions were going to try to dominate the country. And of course, instead of letting that happen, they said separation of church and state. So they all agreed, to that. So that's neat. But George Berkeley was convinced that materialism was going to do away with the need for religion. And I would argue that Berkeley was prescient in that, because at least in Europe and somewhat in the United States, we have a lot of people who are now called nuns. Not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E, right? Yes? No? Does it make sense to folks? Who are the